announcements. Hi, everybody. My name's Agnes Kedmaneds. I'm going to suspect we're going to have a few more people joining us in the next few minutes. So why don't I slowly start to get into our introduction so that we have enough time for our guest speakers. So I will begin so that we have enough room for our guest speakers and for our questions that will be at the end. So welcome to the Woodland Wildlife Wednesdays. If this is your first time joining us on a monthly Wednesday, we have been doing for the past few months a presentation every third Wednesday at noon. We're wanting to do a woodland wildlife-based presentation, and that we'll have one in November about forest health and pest and diseases. That's going to be interesting. Heather Disk is going to give us an update. I'm really looking forward to the work she's doing in Maryland, finding out the status of some of the pests and diseases happening in the state. So that'll be next month, November 18th. The next Woodland Wildlife Wednesday will be November 18th. So my name is Agnes. Here I am, and there's my picture. I'm with the University of Maryland Extension. I am in the Woodland Stewardship Education program. I help coordinate the landowner contact program, and I coordinate the Maryland Delaware Master Logger program. Interesting programs. If you have any questions about either of them, please feel free to get in touch with me. So today's webinar is the importance of landscape scale forest management to meet the full breeding season needs of eastern forest birds. That's a mouthful. We're going to learn a lot today, you guys. If it has a big title like that, we're going to learn a lot about what birds need in the eastern forest to meet their breeding needs. I think this is going to be a great one. And, you know, if I had been smart, I would have put a little quiz up here to ask you guys if you know what these birds are. I'll know that for next time. So what are we going to learn about? So the importance of landscape scale forest management to meet the full breeding season needs of eastern forest birds will be about several studies in the eastern states, including Maryland, demonstrate that forest bird conservation for both game and non-game species depends on woodland complexity. Specifically, forest landscapes should be managed to ensure that stands range from very young to very old. However, this poses a variety of challenges for both private and public forest managers. Using sustainable forestry practices to increase both the age and variety of trees and woodlands has become an important focus of several conservation partners. This presentation will highlight results of recent studies and share with you how their partnership is working to implement sustainable forestry practices to improve forest health and recover declining bird populations. You guys probably have heard about that in the news, eh? Important and information on how woodland owners and how landowners can enroll in the NRCS programs to benefit forest health and forest birds will also be offered. Before we get into it, this is going to be great. I've already had a sneak peek. It's going to be full of lots of information. So before we get into all that information, there's some housekeeping I'd like us to cover. So this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available at the website there, extension.umd.edu/woodland. There are also several other forestry related programs recorded, you know, about property succession, deer management, turkey, taxes. There's lots of stuff there, liabilities, property liability stuff. So it's being recorded. So by you participating and watching, that's giving us permission that you are okay with it being recorded. So thank you all for joining us today. I wanted to let you know some of the benefits of joining in on the webinar. Not only are we getting familiar with extension and some of the people that offer great forestry programs in the state. You're also going to get a free quarterly newsletter. This newsletter, Branching Out, if you're not a subscriber yet, it's a great one. You're going to find out about forestry information. He writes, there's stuff about herbicides sometimes. There's stuff about deer management. That's a big one. And also you're going to be finding out about events. So if you want to opt out of getting that newsletter and finding out about events, please email Pam. She'll be glad to take you off the list at pthomas@umd.edu. And if you want to just put in the message, no events, that'll be great. Also, what's going to happen during this meeting is everybody's going to remain muted. Okay, so hopefully you're going to do that on your own. And as you can see, it's only my face showing. I'm the speaker right now. And so everybody is going to have their video off except for the speaker that's speaking at the time. So hopefully you're seeing some names, and maybe there's some colleagues and friends that are also participating today. So there's going to be a lot of questions. I hope it's going to elicit some great discussion. If you have any questions, please put it in the chat box. Do you see where the chat box is on your screen? It's near the bottom, and it looks like the comic dialogue bubble. Okay, so if you click on that and you type in your question, that'd be great. If you want to speak your question, I'm okay with that. That's cool. Just maybe you could type that in. I'd like to ask my question verbally, and then I will know. So at the end, we'll go through the question. So I'll do this part. Shannon and Jeff will give their presentation, and then at the end, we'll have a time for Q&A, okay? So who are our speakers today? So today we're going to have Dr. Jeffrey Larkin. He's a professor of wildlife and ecology, wildlife ecology and conservation at Indiana University, Pennsylvania, and the Forest Birds Habitat Advisor for the American Bird Conservancy. He also serves as the science advisor for the NRCS Working Lands for Wildlife Eastern Forest Partnership. Jeff is a graduate of Ithaca College and the University of Kentucky, where he got his master's in forestry and a PhD in animal science. He specializes in conservation science that combines his expertise in forestry and wildlife, ecology, and conservation implementation. For the past 9 years, he has developed a private forest stewardship program in partnership with NRCS, American Bird Conservancy, and state agency partners in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. So with him, he'll be joined by Shannon Ferrell. Shannon, hopefully you'll correct me when you come on, is a partner forester at Indiana University of Pennsylvania Research Institute. He works in partnership with the United States Department of Agriculture Natural Resource Conservation Service, the NRCS. And he also works in partnership with the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, the Pennsylvania Game Commission. He also works in partnership with the Maryland Forest Service. Shannon is a graduate of Allegheny College in Maryland and of West Virginia University, where he got his Forest Resource Management degree. For the past 4 years, he has specialized in the NRCS's Working Lands for Wildlife, Golden Wing Warbler, and Cerulean Warbler programs. Oh my gosh, such pretty birds. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Jeff and Shannon to share their screen. So right now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Shannon and Jeff will be taking over. So thank you all for joining us again. And here you go, Jeff and Shannon.
Thank you. And thanks for that great introduction. It's exciting to be here and part of Woodland Wildlife Wednesday for sure. And the title of our talk should probably have a colon after it, and it should be Private Forests Matter. And they really matter a lot. And I hope you get that message quite strongly by the end of our talk. It's great to be able to share the the speaking privileges with Shannon. He is an excellent forester. As you saw that Resource Conservationist Award photo that he was introduced with. So always great to be able to work with some of the foresters that I work so closely with to help deliver forest bird and forest health conservation. I only show this picture because I guess it really kind of gets at, you know, who I am and the passion I have for forests. Agnes provided a little bit of the background about my education and where I am currently in my career. The fact that I have that education in forestry and wildlife ecology and conservation really allows me to focus much of my efforts on bridging forestry and wildlife conservation. And for a long time, that's always been this kind of, for whatever reason, a very contentious relationship, right? Forestry and wildlife. And I hope by the end of this talk, you also come away with a good realization that forestry and wildlife are not at odds, and they do not need to be at odds. And in fact, that the two disciplines require each other's cooperation, and we'll show some examples of that. Maryland's forests are, you know, expansive. They might not be as expansive as the forest to the north in Pennsylvania, but still 2.6 for a state the size of Maryland, 2.6 million acres of forest, 41% of your state. And those forests play a pretty important part of the state's economy and really the natural heritage and the passion that Maryland residents and the many people that visit portions of Maryland have come to appreciate and expect. A lot of folks are attracted to visiting Maryland, or either from close or from afar, to take in its many diverse resources. Maryland's western portion of the state, being part of the Appalachian Mountains, is quite well known for its biodiversity, whether it be plants, animals, fungi. All of those biodiversity are important attractions and are important for the overall health of our forest ecosystems. Now, of course, you don't need to look very far, especially if you're a woodland landowner, to understand and appreciate and become very frustrated with the many threats that our forests face. These come in many forms: invasive species, excessive deer browsing, disease, conversion and fragmentation, and we can throw parcelization in there as well. And then the less obvious, but maybe most ubiquitous, is unsustainable harvest practices, especially on our private lands. All of these threaten that biodiversity that we so appreciate and need for healthy, functioning forests. Loss of biodiversity is one thing that comes from these various threats, but we also recognize other impacts: lack of desired regeneration and loss of long-term economic opportunities that comes with that lack of regeneration, the degradation of water quality, and reduced recreational opportunities. And that's no matter if you're a bird hunter or a bird watcher, a hiker, a camper, whatever that might be. All of these impact the very quality of your experience. We're here to talk about forest birds today, but what I really want to make clear is that, you know, we have a saying. It said, "What's good for the woods is good for the warbler," and I hold true to that, and it is something that I passionately believe in. If we can do good forestry, good forest management, care for our forests, be the stewards that we need to be, a lot of these birds will come along for the ride. Forest birds are one of those groups having a really tough go of it. It's been in the news quite a bit. You know, last year, the paper that was released, the 3 billion birds lost over the last 40, 45, 50 years. 17% of that 3 billion birds were eastern forest birds. Forest birds like the golden winged warbler that you see in that downward pointing arrow. We have other documents that have shown that eastern forest birds, such as this graph to the left of your screen, have been declining for a number of years, such as this graphic that came from the State of the Birds report in 2009, with the blue line being our eastern forest birds declining based on the population trends of 25 indicator eastern forest bird species. Forest birds are, let's just say, loved by researchers, and they have been loved by researchers for a long time, whether it be in the early days of just being curious about forest bird ecology, being attracted to studying these often very vibrantly colored species, or our interest in hunting them, like the woodcock and the grouse you see here. All of that research that has amassed over the years indicates that there are two aspects of forest bird ecology that are really, really important to be thinking about when it comes to forest bird conservation. No matter where they nest, mature forest or young forest, if they nest in a tree hole or on the ground, you name it, landscape context. For example, the percent of forest cover in the landscape, or the stand age class distribution and interspersion, as well as the structural complexity that you find within a stand, any given forest stand, like a well-developed understory or midstory, or a canopy that has gaps and kind of dynamics of gap and regeneration dynamics occurring within those gaps. So why are forest birds in trouble? So we get that question a lot, and of course we pointed out the threats there at the beginning, a few slides of this presentation. But a lot of folks believe that our forests are too simple for forest birds, especially given the fact that we just said that landscape context and within stand structure matters. Consider in one massive sweep, we lost thousands, that's right, thousands of years of structural diversity in the making. Our historic photographs and accounts from explorers tell us this. And we're fortunate that in many places, forest has come back. Of course, in Maryland, we know that much of its forest did not come back, but still, with 41% of your state in forest, 2.6 million acres, we're fortunate to have forest resources in the landscape. But all of that forest being cleared at the same time, essentially, has resulted in our forest age class distribution to be quite skewed to just a very small, narrow window of what we would expect an eastern forest age class distribution to be historically. So you can see that we're lacking young forests on this graph, not a lot of it. And we don't have a lot of old forests. And let's face it, right? This graph should probably go like way out here, but it doesn't. This graph was from a very nice paper by Shifley in 2014 that talked about eastern forests in general. This is from a document specific to Maryland from the USDA. And you can see here the change early on, 1940s, 1960s to 2020. You can see here the amount, the availability of young forest and old forest, older forest for say mature forest. And then of course our younger forest age classes. But let's keep in mind, we have a lot of this that we need to move beyond into that late successional stage. But we certainly need to address the fact that we are lacking early successional forest as well. So if we think about this age class distribution in this simple bar graph being, a lot of this, too much, one would say, not too much forest, too much of that age forest relative to the bookends. So it's not a surprise that when we think about the species of birds that are most jeopardized or most imperiled in our eastern landscapes, it's the species that typically are associated with the bookends. Typically, we'll talk about a little bit more about this in a moment. And unsustainable harvest practices is something that affects both ends of that spectrum. You think about diameter limit cut or a select cut. Those types of harvests ignore residual species composition, the quality of the trees that are left in the stand, the density of the trees left in that stand, and often, of course, a failure to regenerate a forest, to restart that successional process. And that, of course, is important, not just from a sustainable forestry perspective, but from a wildlife habitat perspective as well. When we link that to those pressures we mentioned a moment ago, like Japanese stiltgrass and you name your invasive of the week, hay-scented fern, a native, but often an invasive native, especially in areas with high deer numbers. Speaking of deer, you know, that added pressure of deer. This is one of our study sites actually across the border in Pennsylvania. Commercial timber harvests where half was fenced and half was unfenced, and resulting in quite a discrepancy in regeneration in those. This would be a portion of one of those unfenced harvests. So yeah, forest age class distribution of today is not quite where we need it to be. And a lot of these birds on the bookends are in trouble. But so too are some of these birds that actually are mostly associated with mature forest. When I say associated, I mean in the construct of the human management or labeling perspective. So the wood thrush that just popped up into your screen here is often thought of as that, you know, that iconic mature forest bird of the eastern deciduous forests. And certainly it nests in such places. But we're learning that species like the wood thrush is also declining. It's one of the big 5 eastern forest birds that's declining. And it makes you, of course, you want to scratch your head when you say, wow, but it has all of this habitat available to it, right? All of this forest that it apparently likes so much and prefers and nests in. And that is true. But what we've done actually is we've come a long way as wildlife scientists in our ability to monitor. And it used to be that a lot of what we had studied was associated with the nesting period, right? Which is only about a 28, 25, 30 day period of a breeding bird's time with us here in North America. What happens when those birds leave the nest and before they migrate back to South America or Central America or the Caribbean is something that we didn't know a whole lot about. We started 2 studies, 2014, both studies. Golden Wing Warbler went a little bit longer, but these were in Pennsylvania, where we wanted to understand the post-fledging ecology of these 2 imperiled species in our managed forests of Pennsylvania. So we would wait for their, find their nests. We'd wait for their nest to be about of what we'd say the fledging age, which is typically around, let's say on average, age 9, age 8, 9. And we would place a small transmitter on some of these fledglings. And we would track these fledglings around their landscapes. And we found, and as others have found with some other forest bird species, we found that where they nest is not exactly where they go after they leave the nest. So you can see this fledgling here, which was hatched out of a nest here in this timber harvest, an overstory removal or regeneration harvest. You can see the dotted residual trees across this stand, but it's a regeneration harvest. It was born in at this blue dot, and tracked every day. And over that 30-day period, I want you to notice that polygon up that I just threw in up there to the top right. That is a 25-year-old regenerated clear cut. 25 years, so you can imagine what that kind of stand looks like, even age. The bird leaves the nest, and over the course of that 30 days, not only does it survive, which is really an important thing, right? I mean, you can have the highest nest success possible, but if offspring aren't living to be of age to disperse and migrate, then of course you've only solved half the problem. So what we see is this bird, as it became capable of moving more and more across the landscape, that it actually sought out this type of cover. And this was quite consistent for many of our golden wing warbler fledglings. Cerulean warbler was no different. We saw this cerulean warbler fledgling move across this forested landscape of the Allegheny National Forest. It was born in a shelter on the edge of between two shelter woods, and moved along this edge of this regenerating harvest, right? So there's lots of complexity. Think about light penetrating into the canopy here. It wasn't in the clear cut, right? It was along the edge of it. Moved down a forest road, moved into a 25-year-old clear cut, and then before the battery failed at day 30, just as it became independent from its parents, it was in a shelterwood harvest again. So what we learn here is that forest birds may nest in something that looks like one thing. For example, the cerulean warbler in canopy gapped shelter woods and edges of shelter woods, and golden wing warblers in young regenerating forests and shrublands. But they go to quite different types of places, and making sure that those places are available to them within the context of their biological capabilities, right? This is the landscape importance of what we're here to talk about today. Landscape matters because you need to have the right amounts of forest conditions to meet the full breeding season habitat needs of forest birds. And we could argue that this is the same no matter if it's a forest bird or a black bear. A black bear is doing great on acorns in an acorn year, where when there's an acorn crop and there's acorn and oak trees around. But think about a black bear in the context of a landscape that has a failure of oak mass that year. Having a diverse amount of resources, options, if you will, of forage options for something like a black bear is just as important. Same for deer, even though we label it as, you know, one of those threats to the forest, a threat because of overabundance only in the context of limited forage. So we think about managing for these imperiled forest birds, we are definitely needing to think about, all right, it was born in a nest on the black dot, but on average they go after 30 days or within 30 days within this whole yellow sphere. And for the cerulean warbler, it's even larger on average. So we need to be thinking about what's available on the landscape to ensure that we have a mosaic of forest management outcomes on the ground to benefit these juveniles after they leave the nest. And this is one of my students' drawings. He was one of the students that studied golden wing warbler post-fledging ecology. And these are drawings of what that species looks like as it leaves the nest, 2 days, no tail, look at that, can hardly fly. And then of course, by the end of 30 days where it looks pretty much like an adult. We need to do our best to make sure that our forests have the structure and the composition, the resources available for these birds to be able to undergo this entire molting and approach the independent stage. And we're not alone when we're talking about golden wing warbler and cerulean warbler. And the post-fledging dispersal and habitat use and home range of juvenile wood thrushes was one paper, just one paper, a number of paper on wood thrush that showed through post-fledging research that showed that it's important for the species as well. And I'll just read real quick here. Our data suggests that in large tracts of mature forest, A mosaic of early and mid-successional forest stands, along with mature riparian forests, will accommodate both the breeding and post-dispersal habitat requirements of wood thrush. You could have as much wood thrush nesting habitat as you want, but if you don't have the right landscape context, the species will suffer. And that's what we're seeing, I believe, with all of that middle-aged mature forest on the landscape, and still seeing wood thrush populations declining. The whippoorwill. We all miss the whippoorwill. Some of us are fortunate to still have it on the landscape with us in those summer evenings to be able to hear the song of the whippoorwill. Forest management for whippoorwill should consider harvest strategies that maintain the availability of regenerating patches in close proximity to mature forests. We're not saying no mature forest. We're not saying all young forest. We're saying a mixture of forest age classes. Great research starting to get out of the agricultural, traditional agricultural context and thinking about the role of forests for declining pollinators. Roberts and King up in southern New England found that young forests in the landscape was important for increasing the abundance and diversity of pollinators. I recently had a master's student who's now doing a PhD at Penn State at the Pollinator Center. She found that harvests created in the name of golden-winged warbler, we'll be talking a little bit more of the specific examples of that here in a moment. We found that over 2 years of pollinator surveys and floral surveys, and these were when flowering, she identified 220 species of flowering plants in regenerating timber harvests on private and public lands in Pennsylvania, just across your border. And thriving pollinator communities, whether it be butterflies, native bees, bumblebees, and the like. Forests are important, diversely structured forests are important for fishers as well. A radiotelemetry study showed that structurally diverse forests were necessary, especially as it related to their rest site selection. Like you can see this fisher with its tail hanging out of this pileated woodpecker hole, using it as a day rest site. But you can see the complexity around this. You can see that there's young forest conditions or attributes, as well as really large trees and all sorts of structure. Bats. Bats are always a contentious species when it comes to managing our forests. In a recent study by some of the really the North American renowned scientists as it comes to forest management in bats, came to the conclusion in their review that we need to consider maintaining diverse landscapes that include early successional patches, abundant edges, woodland savannas, and mature to older forest stands. You see, these are all the stories, the conclusions that a diverse collective of scientists are saying about what our forest birds need. And it's not just about forest birds. It's not just about birds or wildlife. It's actually about forests and forest health as well. And as forest owners, that's where we need your help. We need your help because A, 76% of your forests in Maryland are privately owned. So obviously you play a pretty important role. Sustainable forestry provides a continuum of forest conditions for all bird species. And when we think about what foresters do, foresters are educated. Yeah, of course they take into account wildlife. But when this forester thinks about this stand and bringing this stand to the regeneration harvest, and then what that stand looks like afterward, thinking about, he or she is thinking about, their silvicultural knowledge, their experience and education in the practice of managing forests and mitigating all of those threats along the way. And it just so happens to be that all of these bird best management practices that are out there, whether it be for thrushes, whether it be for cerulean warbler, golden wing warbler, ruffed grouse, they all align with what that forester is trying to do on the landscape. And he's not necessarily sitting there with these documents. It's just that these documents actually fit into the sustainable forestry framework. And when you think about the fact that all of these birds tend to move about the landscape after they leave the nest, it's pretty easy to see that forest bird conservation and sustainable forest management is a perfect match. And foresters know how to mitigate the threats. Shannon will talk about this in a moment, some of those things. All of the tools in the toolbox need to be available to them. Of course, this is costly. And if we're very honest with ourselves, improving our forest health, managing forests sustainably is really costly, which is often why it is not done across much of our private landscapes. But when it is done, you can have outcomes like this. This is one of the stands that Shannon managed in Western Maryland. And this is me on a site visit with Shannon and some others. And I'm just sitting on the ground in an understory that is, let's just call it, polluted with oak regeneration. And that's not a bad outcome. It doesn't need to just be early successional forests that we make. Even if it's the conditions the practices that we implement that make a mature forest more resilient. Like this stand that may never, ever, ever be harvested, but just minor tweaks to some of the management within the stand allowed for this stand to experience some oak regeneration. What happens when this stand is subjected to the next round of gypsy moth mortality? Do we get a red maple forest, or do we have a half a chance of getting an oak forest back in its place? That's what being more resilient is all about. You know, there's often, I mentioned at the beginning, often this perception is created that, you know, either the foresters win or the wildlife biologists win. And I'm here to say that I reject that argument, and that argument really has no place in our landscape, particularly our eastern forest landscape. Sustainable forest management, healthy forests, thriving wildlife populations, diverse populations of wildlife and plants, and all of the biodiversity that we find in these forests is important. Science shows that forestry and wildlife science needs to work as a collective. And we know that there are shared goals and shared objectives already. But we have to act with some urgency. And, you know, no solution, inaction that is not an option. That's Shipley paper. These forests will uniformly grow old without management intervention. We got a lot of vanilla flavored forest on the landscape, a lot of this middle-aged. We need to find ways to meet the habitat needs, the structural needs of these species, and we don't have a lot of time. This is the cerulean warbler population trend since the 1960s to a little over 2010. Does the cerulean warbler have 100 years for all of our forests to become structurally complex via just aging? The golden wing warbler, the same. Does it have 40 years, 50 years, 100 years to wait for our forest to age on its own? No. Some of our forests will, of course, but we need to be proactive in making sure that we are addressing their habitat needs now. So here's our conservation canvas, if you will. Where do we want to focus our resources on Eastern Forest Conservation Canvas? Well, The first category that we could divide these forest acres into is private and public forests. And we're going to focus on private forests today because, as you can see from this map, private forests are really, really, really important. Hugely important. If we cannot make gains on the private forest landscape, then we are likely doomed in our ability to reverse the declines of many forest wildlife species. There's a lot of you in Maryland, 130,000 of you, and you're stewards of 76% or 1.9 million acres of Maryland's forests. You are huge stakeholders in this conversation. And we understand and we recognize that sustainably managing your forests is technically challenging and costly. And there are many landowners out there that are, the research has shown that they're hesitant to do much in their forests because they don't know, right? It's technically challenging. It's not something they're familiar with. And of course, a large component of private landowners say that doing things a certain way is very costly, and we recognize that, and it is very costly. Well, luckily, in 2012, we started teaming up with NRCS to have positive impacts on both forest health and sustainability, as well as to reverse the decline of the golden-winged warbler. The golden-winged warbler was selected as one of 7 original working lands for wildlife species at the national level. Working lands for wildlife is about finding win-win solutions for wildlife and producers or landowners, with 3 main underlying, I guess, objectives. Remove threats to wildlife and improve the sustainability of working lands. So when I say working lands, think about your working forests, however they work for you. To implement enough of the right conservation practices in the right places so that we benefit the wildlife populations that we're targeting. And then, of course, having a monitoring and assessment component so that we are certain that we have an effective and growing, ever-evolving delivery program. So we're able to provide financial assistance through NRCS to private landowners. Shannon is one of those. We have several stretched from Virginia to northern Pennsylvania. Here is the landscape we work in, and I'm going to pause for a moment and say, just because if you're a landowner and you're not in this area, doesn't mean that we can't help you find help through an NRCS office in your county to do good things for your forest through things like equip forestry. And that's just a fancy, I know, jargony kind of a term. Just know that there are programs out there that can benefit your forests as well. It allows us to have planners and foresters that can do a turnkey approach, meet with private landowners, talk about their objectives, do some Silva data collection, help prepare areas to be treated, work with the contractors and the landowners to ensure that a project that is targeting sustainable forestry and golden-winged warbler habitat has the outcome that we all desire. Here's a young forest that has golden-winged warblers in it now. Think about what this forest looks like in 15 years with all of those residual big canopy trees peeking up over the top of 15 to 20-year-old forest. It's going to be a pretty spectacular place if you think about it from a bird structural complexity perspective. And we've been privileged to have over 400 landowners work with us across the working lands geography. And I'd like to turn it over for a few minutes to Shannon to share a little bit about what he does in working with landowners. Shannon, I will advance the slides for you if you just tell me next.
Okay. Yep. So I'm Shannon Ferrell. I'm a NRCS partner forester, and kind of walk you through the Golden Wing program now. You can go to the next slide. So, initially you call into the office or send me an email, even after this webinar, and then we'd set up a day for the initial site visit. Come out, I'd probably bring a map of the property with me, and then we would basically just go for a walk and see what your forest has to offer at the moment, and then see if there's things we can do there. Most people in Maryland have a forest management plan that really helps us, a good starting point anyways, whether we be looking at doing, herbicide treatments to control invasive species, or if, there's areas where we can do some type of harvest to create that habitat. So, the initial site visit, we'd come out, if we'd find a project area, we would go ahead and GPS that area and try to, we really like to try to create as much edge habitat as possible. And then we're going to collect some Silva data. Silva data is just basically forest inventory data that analyzes your stand and kind of gives us some recommendations on management practices. Yep. So then after we collect that data, run it through Silva, we come up with a stand level plan, which is basically something you see on your right, where we have in orange, we have the stand that we're talking about. And then we basically just create a golden warbler specific stand level management plan, just specifically for that area. Which would include, if we're doing any herbicide treatments or, what all management practices we are going to do. And then we'll also have timelines for completion in coordination with NRCS in that plan. And then also you'll get to review this plan before, we put it into a contract. You'll get to work with, we'll give you a list of herbicide contractors and consulting foresters so that before you get in a contract, you'll know if you'll be able to get the work done. And you'll also see what kind of cost share NRCS will be able to provide you, for example, to get herbicide work done. Okay, next slide. Just some examples of herbicide treatments. Over here on the left, it looks like we had, we'd sprayed some fern or some stiltgrass, maybe some stiltgrass over here on the right. Fern and stiltgrass are pretty big on most properties here in Western Maryland. We do a lot of herbicide work to control those. And then, here with the X, we have Ailanthus or tree of heaven that we've done some hack and squirt work with. And then here you can see the tops of the tree of heaven coming down. Really, really big as well. So if we go in and we cut those trees, they just kind of pop back up even thicker. So here we have some pictures of shoulder harvest. So on the left, you have an active harvest that's going on, and you can kind of see how dense this forest is, and then we're taking out, you can see the wood we're taking out down on the bottom is basically pulpwood. So your low quality wood. And the picture in the middle is afterwards. This is very currently afterwards. And the picture on the right is probably 2 to 3 years post-harvest. You can see you're getting some regeneration to come back. You're still getting a lot of sunlight and still creating that nice thick habitat. All right. Then once you have the regeneration coming back from the shoulderwood harvest, then we can go to the overstory removal, where we're leaving, about, somewhere 10 to 40 square feet of basal area per acre, and really letting that regeneration take off, creating that nice thick habitat where our golden wings are going to be nesting. Okay, and then we have, the contract implementation and practice completion. So basically, once we have, once you get to that step where you have the shelterwood harvest complete, we can come out and certify that practice and get you your cost share for doing that practice. And then once you have that regen, we try to do over on the right the overstory removal and get you certified for that too. And again, we can provide list of herbicide contractors, consulting foresters, Maryland master loggers. We always recommend that you work with a consulting forester anytime that we're doing any type of timber harvesting.
Thanks, Shannon. And then just a couple of slides. It's important under the Working Lands for Wildlife model that we assess outcomes, right? It's important that we spend those dollars on financial assistance to landowners and technical assistance for those landowners to understand if it's having the desired outcomes for our forests and forest wildlife. And we've done this, and this would be really its own talk in and of itself. But these are all points in which we've monitored across Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Western Maryland over a 4-year period. We go to each site that has had conservation delivered to it, management practices implemented, and then we do 2 levels of analyses. Within the footprint, if you will, of the actual management, point counts for birds and vegetation surveys. And then we use also a larger landscape scale analysis, more done in geographic information systems. And then we learn, right? We learn that in the Central Appalachians, about 30% of our sites became occupied. And it's important to point that of all the information we collected, the most important was at the patch level, was the number of growing seasons post-management. It takes time for the structure of those vegetation elements that the golden wing need to be able to become, to succeed, to become what it is that the golden wing needs. And then we find that at the landscape level, the amount of deciduous forest in the landscape is very important. And you have to be working in landscapes with a limited amount of mixed forest in the landscape. We also learned that golden wing warblers like to be near each other. And that's really important for assessing outcomes for golden wing warbler. 99% of the sites that were occupied by this species were less than 8.5 miles from a known occupied site. So we use that information to help refine our targeting, like where we're going to spend. If we have a nickel to spend on golden wing warbler forest conservation practices, where should we spend them to have the greatest chances of success? And we'll finish by just saying that, as I mentioned, it's not about young forest, it's not about old forest. In this case, we're talking about the golden wing warbler. But we use all forms of, as Shannon showed you, we use all forms of forest management practices to help us achieve the desired outcomes that take into account forest health and that species recovery. And to really diversify forest structure for many of those other species that come along for the ride. We're really honored to have been invited to speak to y'all today, and we look forward to taking any questions that you might have. We provided our contact information at the bottom of the screen. I'm just privileged to coordinate a really excellent group of foresters and conservation planners like Shannon. They're the ones that are the work horses out there on the landscape doing the important work that needs to be done, having those honest conversations with landowners and helping them achieve the objectives they have for their woodlands. So you can contact me, but really, Shannon's the go-to in Maryland for sure. Thank you.
Great, you guys. Thank you so much. Shannon and Jeff. That was very informative. Lots of information to take in there. So I'm going to get onto the question portion right now. I see that it's 5-1. We'll probably go a little over 1 o'clock, but so if you need to sign off at 1, that's fine. I just wanted to remind y'all of the next Woodland Wildlife Wednesday session is November 18th. It's going to be Heather Disk. She's going to be doing about forest health in Maryland, pests and diseases. So join in on that one. That's November 18th. It's going to be another good one. So let's get to some of the questions here. Again, we will be going a little over 1 o'clock here. First off, this was the first question that popped in my mind. Do y'all have a tree ID book that you like the best? Would it be Sibley, or what's your favorite tree ID book? And not tree ID book, bird ID book. I meant bird ID book.
Oh, bird ID. Well, I guess I do like Sibley, but to be quite honest with you, I guess Peterson's a good one. I have, and I have to say that only because it's more sentimental, the most favorite bird field guide I have is the, some of you may remember, it was the Golden Guide. It's this blue covered with nice kind of animated birds on the front. I love it just because it does a nice job identifying the birds and talking about their describing their habitats. But it's just, of course, one that I learned ornithology from a young age. So there are a variety out there, but I would say that those are the big three, and certainly Sibley is very well known. And a lot of folks are moving on to more of the bird apps, and of course.
I use the Audubon app.
Yeah, so there's an Audubon app. There's a Sibley's has a great app as well. There are some free ones as well that are out there. So, don't be afraid to, unplug when you go birding, but don't unplug too much, because you can actually get a lot of nice song recordings that are associated. So you might not only just get a map of where the species could be found, date range where it can be found, a description of its habitat, but boy, it comes in really handy when there's that one bird in the bush that you can't get a glimpse of, and you're able to actually hear its song and then kind of sit there and go, all right, what was it that I heard? Maybe it was this.
Great. You guys, thanks for that advice. Appreciate
Sure.
it. So I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to go with the audience questions first. So we have a question here. Does the nesting habitat of mature forest for wood thrush and other birds need to be a contiguous block? If so, what is the minimum block size that y'all have been finding?
Well, a lot of work has been done on the wood thrush on that topic, and the negative effects of things like cowbirds are greatest in small blocks of habitat in agriculturally dominated landscapes. Block size becomes a little less important to a lot less important as you move out of those heavy agricultural lands. So with that said, it's hard for me to give you an estimate unless kind of really knowing exactly where we're talking about.
Let's say that it was not a very heavily agricultural area, maybe like somewhere up in the mountains there, maybe Allegheny or Garrett County.
Well, they tend to not be affected too much by kind of the exact block size. It's more of the distribution of forest conditions across that, across the forest patch. A nice study by Schlossberg and King a couple of years ago, not in Maryland, but not far. Massachusetts looked at managed forest landscapes and unmanaged forest landscapes with respect to full season reproductive success of wood thrush. And they found that in these managed forest blocks, that the density of all things being equal, the density was actually of adult pairs, so breeders, was higher in those managed forest landscapes. And of course, fledgling survival and nesting success were equal. So if we're trying to grow populations, and nesting success and fledgling survival are equal in these two places, then of course it's to our benefit to have more individual breeders in the landscape. And they found that to be the case in these managed forest blocks.
Great. Okay, so the next question here is, what was the singular event approximately 60 years ago that disrupted the range of forest stands? Was there an event that disrupted the range of forest stands?
Yep.
Was it building suburbs?
So you have two things. Well, I think that this question is probably stemming from the age class distribution graph that we showed. So those are still forest, and they're just of that age. So you have two things that are at work in the patterns of age across our eastern forests. First is the forest that was cleared and allowed to become forest again. But then, of course, there was a significant part of our landscape that was cleared, farmed, and then farmland abandonment occurred. And that farmland abandonment occurred pretty rapidly across many of those acres. And you get succession on those farmlands to be of about the same age. So that's where, when we think about the historical human impacts on vast amounts of acreages in the eastern US, it's farmland abandonment and landscape level clearing of our forests for forestry, for forest products.
Great. So this is a question that we talked about a little bit, but wonder if we can kind of do a bullet form answer to this. How much does good management cost? So this may be a good one for Shannon.
Yep.
How much does good management cost, and what are potential funding sources? Shannon, oh my gosh.
It's a great one for Shannon. He lives life every day. If his phone rings or email dings, it's just on this subject. So go for it, Shannon.
Yeah, the biggest cost we see is herbicide treatment, to control invasive species. And some of that cost, if you're doing the work yourself, it's not too bad. But if you're having a bigger area and you get a herbicide contractor in to do the work, you could be looking at probably anywhere from $120 an acre to maybe $300 an acre. But we do have cost share that, our cost share pretty much goes anywhere from $60 an acre to right now, like $310 to $20 an acre, somewhere in there. So we can pretty well cover it for the most part.
And it just requires the landowner being, comfortable in going into a contract with USDA NRCS. It is, we worked with over 400 landowners, and there's no strings attached, really. I promise you that. It's about getting the technical. Shannon comes free, right? He gets to come out to your visit, or any one of our foresters gets to come out to your property. That's paid for via grants and NRCS funds. In the plan writing, visiting with you and the landowner and discussing your objectives for your properties and how that aligns with Working Lands for Wildlife or any of the other NRCS programs that are available to you. That's covered. And then the assistance with the plan is covered. And that's where we identify those we call them conservation practices. Each of those conservation practices have a payment amount associated with them. So the landowner would know exactly how much they would get in assistance from NRCS on a per acre basis.
Before they sign a contract.
Exactly.
So you would know that dollar amount before you sign a contract, and then you can decide if you're going to do the work or if you're going to hire a contractor.
Great.
And then the
I
big
like,
thing is talking to the contractor before you get in a contract.
right. So we're not just shaking hands on this deal, right?
Right. And then there's also, to point out really quickly, is of course Maryland Forestry Service has some programs that help offset some of these costs as well, that that Shannon and his state agency partners could put you in contact with.
Okay, great. So you're expanding this question. So I liked hearing free. Hey, so Shannon and his team are free, and he will kind of walk through, like you said, doing the Silva and going onto the land and stuff, and then setting up that contract and putting prices associated with that contract. I have a question. So does the landowners that you're working with, this is a two-part question, do they have to have a forest stewardship, forest conservation plan, forest management plan? And the next question is there a minimum acreage that y'all serve or maximum acreage?
Yes, in Maryland, they have to have a forest stewardship plan or a forest management plan. They do not have to have it when I come to the property initially, but by the time that they get in an NRCS contract, they have to have some type of forest management plan. Then our minimum acreage in Maryland is 10 acres for the gold. Well, that's, I guess, project wide, is 10 acres minimum for golden wing habitat. And then Maryland, right now, there's still no real maximum. Pennsylvania, you get into a cost share maximum dollar amount, which is like roughly like 70 couple acres.
Okay. So I liked hearing you say that before the landowner contacts you, they don't have to have a forest stewardship or management plan. That's great to hear. So do you help write that forest stewardship plan with them, or is that the point where they get in touch with their county forester or consulting forester to get that done?
Yeah, in Maryland, they would get in touch with either the Maryland Forest Service or a private consultant forester, which I can provide them with a list of those people in the area.
Okay, so you're holding our hand through that whole deal.
Yep.
Okay, great. And
And it's important to say that sometimes we get landowners that decide they don't want to enroll in the Golden Wing program, but they go after meeting with Shannon or a private lands forester, they go ahead and have the forest management plan done for their property, which is a great win. I mean, we look at that as a solid win for the woods as well.
Well, and for the landowner, we're not even going to get into the benefits of having a forest stewardship plan, like saving on your taxes, but so you mentioned something else. Sorry to harp on this question a little bit. I will get to the other questions, I promise. But I liked also what you said, that Shannon can hook the landowner up with other forestry enhancement or project programs that aren't necessarily this one. So that's great. So getting in touch with Shannon will kind of open up a door for us for other things, is what I'm also hearing too.
Yes.
Great.
Yep. We can run through all kinds of programs through the Maryland Forest Service, or we also run through all kinds of programs of NRCS.
And what I like,
even dabble into a little bit of ag stuff too. Just depends what we see when we're out there.
So that's good for the people that have ag and forest land too. That's interesting when we think about those soft edges here. Oh, great. Good. I forget what my other question was. That's a good thing. Okay, so the next question from John is, will NRCS have an equivalent wildlife, working lands forest process in New York anytime soon? So will this program be in New York anytime soon, y'all?
It already is. A matter of fact, portions of New York are part of working lands for wildlife for golden wing warbler. I think so. After the original 7 species came on board, NRCS called for what we call working lands for wildlife 2.0 projects. And that allowed states and collections of states to have identify their own set of special working lands for wildlife projects. And I think there's like some blanding turtles and some other like wood turtle working lands for wildlife efforts in New York. But of course, New York also has equip forestry and other programs that any landowner could sign up for and compete for funding. So yeah, New York is definitely in the working lands for wildlife business for sure.
Great, good to hear. There you go, New York. Excellent. So the next question is, what is killing the oak trees? This sounds like we're promoting next month's Woodland Wildlife Wednesday. Hey, that's a good question. I wanted to help send this link here, Ask an Expert with University of Maryland Home and Garden Center. They're super great. You can send them pictures of your leaves and your trees, and they will answer those promptly within about 24 hours. So, and that's a great question. Again, for next month, hopefully you can join us. Do you have any thoughts? Anybody want to interject with any thoughts about those oak trees?
Well, I mean, we'll let those experts speak to what's killing all the oak trees. From my perspective, what we work most at is not really what's killing oak trees. It's what's failing. It's what's preventing oak trees from becoming established. So what's killing oak, in my mind, what's the biggest threat to oaks and oak forests is the fact that unsustainable forest management is done, removing acorn producing oak trees at a rate that disallows them to actually have regeneration in place first, and then faster growing species win the race to the sunlight, essentially, and we lose oak from our forest. It's called the mesification of our forests. Red maple, black birch, even tulip poplar can do that for sure.
Great. Thanks for your thoughts. Shannon, any thoughts on that too?
Yeah, the biggest thing too there would be, I mean, if it's just a couple trees, send some pictures, then we could help out.
Right. Okay, great. Thanks, you guys. So next question. So golden wing warblers need various stages like woodcock. Are there recommendations on the size of the cut to achieve the results?
Well, in the Appalachians, 10 acres is good. The reason we have the 10-acre limit is because a pair, the research over a number of years across the species range showed that a pair requires about 10 acres of forest throughout the entire nesting period. So they might not defend 10 acres, but they go off and they forage in those adjacent 10 acres. The bigger, the better, especially in forested landscapes that have limited amount of young forest. Because remember, they're looking to settle in landscapes that have golden wing warblers in them. They are not, everyone thinks that they're monogamous. They come back and they find their mate and they have a nest, and it's actually not quite true. The males and the females are cheating on each other left and right, and that nest down here, that is this female's nest, but that could actually, those eggs could belong to 2 or 3 other males. No pun intended, but I guess so. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket if you're a male, right? Because if that was one male's output and it was predated, then he would have not passed on his genetics this entire year.
Great. Okay, I'll get on to the other questions. I'm all these questions. I love these questions because they're giving me more questions. I was thinking about the silviculture lake. So when they asked their minimum acreage required in order to do what's the size of the cut, I was thinking the type of cut too. You guys talked a lot about shelterwood cuts too. So do you want to speak on the type of cut that is most beneficial, or so the type of silvicultural approach that you would go into, what kind of harvest, or is it subjective to the type of property?
Go ahead, Shannon. I mean, it's subjective.
I mean, that's the type of harvest is all about forest health. If we go out to the property and we have oak regeneration present, above deer browse, we're going to try to go ahead and do an overstory removal. But most of the time, we're trying to fix the forest and, get that regeneration to try to come back. So most of the time, we go out there, there's no regeneration present at all. So we're doing a shelter wood harvest. Very, very few properties you go out to where they have a bunch of oak regeneration present.
Yeah, to be very fair, we visit far more properties that need a whole lot of love in many respects, and rarely do we enroll landowners in like a single practice. We're usually, it's a comprehensive review, and the Silva data help guide us as to what needs to be done. And it's not, it's important to know within the sustainable forestry perspective, it's not something that gets done overnight or within a year. We're usually talking about multiple years of managing that particular stand to get it where we want to get it to responsibly regenerate the forest.
Great. So the next question, I think we've answered this, but y'all can, what is the minimum acreage of forest required in order to get help from NRCS?
I don't think there is there is no minimum acreage requirement for like general forestry equip kind of funds. The 10-acre rule is specific to the science behind the golden winged warbler. But if you're a landowner that desires to have some work on your woodland, and that's an important question, because I realize that the vast majority of Maryland landowners own less than 10 acres of forest. So that all of a sudden, many of you might be sitting on here going like, dang, 10 acres, we're out of the story already. But that's not true. We again would fail at forest conservation in general if we don't account for all of those thousands of landowners that actually have 10 acres or less.
So we can still call Shannon if we have less than 10 acres, and then we would not need a forest stewardship plan if we had less than 10 acres.
So for a forest stewardship plan in Maryland, as long as you have 5 forested acres, so to take out, they usually take out like an acre for your house, and then 5 forested acres after that to get a forest stewardship plan. Anything less, you don't have to have a forest stewardship plan.
Okay. So how much acreage do you have to do a forest management plan? Hey, there you go, Rhodes. We just answered that one. Good. And there's my accent expert. We had a couple of thank yous, and that was terrific, you guys. People had to jump off at the top of the hour there, but we got some support there, and thanks and gratitude on that. So I have this one last question here, y'all. So if you have any other questions, bring them up. Does it have to be 10 acres all on one tax record? For example, I own 3 plots which border each other, and they total almost 11 acres.
Nope, that doesn't matter as long as they touch.
Yeah, in a matter of fact, it brings us to another important point, and we have to understand the flexibility that's at hand here, and we can talk more about this. In some states, they're doing this already. If you own 5 acres, your neighbor owns 5 acres, and your other neighbor owns 5 acres, and you collectively want to improve the forest health across your 15 acres of forest, we actually have folks in discussion talking about kind of like binding or coupling these contracts. And that's really important when we start talking about trying to get contractors to come in and do the work, because it's very hard to attract someone to come and do 5 acres of forest management. If you can increase the acreage in the local, geography, that's much more attractive to those contractors from a, you know, an economics perspective, moving equipment from one site to another. So we have some folks in Pennsylvania that are making these kind of like private land centers where they're working to try to create these collectives of landowners within this local landscape and go in collectively to implement forest management to have a greater impact.
Great. Yeah. And I think you hit on some great points there, getting the work done on small acreages and the challenges behind that. And luckily we have somebody to hold our hand through that process that, you know, has built relationships with these contractors and understands the program. So that's what's great about partnering with Shannon there. That's the last of our questions, y'all. Jeff, there's your email on there, and Shannon, there's your email. I'm just going to say your phone number out loud here. It's 240-979-8061. Feel free to call them. I think one of the things that I loved about this presentation is, first off, the lovely pictures. Loved seeing all that animation. Also, the reminder that working with the landowner, the forester, and the harvester is so important to meet your land use objectives. So I think that this really reiterates that landowners, you can still meet your objectives of your land use, and working with these partners to help you do that. And, you know, sometimes we have to invest in that, and Shannon can try and help us figure out the best way to direct our investment too, which is lovely to know.
Yeah, and to oversee that process, because we all know that the best plan is just a plan. And if you're like me in the kitchen, you know, my grandma gave me a bunch of her recipes, but I'm not grandma. And I try to follow those recipes, and sometimes I mess up. It was wonderful when grandma was around and stand over my shoulder and be able to tell me exactly how to do it the right way, right? So we have some of those individuals on the landscape with us, like Shannon, that can make sure that not only is the plan written, but, you know, check in every now and then with the contractors and the foresters and the loggers when they're on site, and say, hey, oh yeah, you know, that looks good, or oh, you know what, you know, you got to tweak it a little bit. This is what we really need. So,
right.
Yep.
All right, y'all. Unless I didn't see, I see a thanks for the valuable information to utilize. People are feeling very grateful. This was great. Thank you. We're getting some messages in of gratitude, because we're going to wrap it up here, folks, unless you all have anything else you want to say.
We just thank you all for tuning in today and allowing us to be a part of your Wednesday afternoon.
I appreciate you guys being here, you guys. Thanks for doing this. This is so great. All right, one last plug for November 18th, Forest Health and Pests and Diseases with Heather Disk. She's the forest health entomologist for Maryland Department of Agriculture. So I hope I'm going to see you at the next Woodland Wildlife Wednesday. All right, y'all. Thank you so much. You take care. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.